So welcome everybody. Excited to have you in class today. Today is a fantastic class all about the Constitutional Convention, what brought us to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and then what happened at the Constitutional Convention. As always, the National Constitution Center's classes love when you ask questions and you share your ideas in the chat. So my name is Curry Sotner. I'm going to be kind of your tour guide through this class today, and really just chat monitor in a big way as well. So send me those questions, send me those ideas. And we are so lucky because our tour leader is going to be Tom Donnelly, who's one of our top scholars at the National Constitution Center. So Tom, do you want to kick it off and say hello to all the students?
Hello, everyone. So glad to have you here.
So Tom, we have a lot to go over today. The two of us have drank lots of coffee and we're super excited about this content. So students, I hope you're with us this morning with the same amount of energy. We'll start framing some questions for everybody. So Tom, as we dive into this is a pretty wide range of time. So leading up to the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, and then what happens at the convention, but there's a lot that brings us to this point. And so we start with a great question is, why did the founding generation even need to write a constitution in the first place? What was the need for this Constitution? What did we have before the Constitution? Hint, hint, Articles of Confederation. And then what were the lived experiences of the founding generation leading up to the Constitutional Convention that helped them understand what was the new world that they needed to build as a government? And then everybody's favorite, Shays Rebellion. And then we'll end with some standard big principles of the Constitution that we all hear people talk about every single day. How are they mixed into that Constitution that we have? So that's a lot to do in 30 minutes with questions from the students, Tom, but I have full faith in you. So you ready to get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, big idea. You lead us through it.
Sure. So the big idea here is that, remember, the founding generation, the founders, they were children of the Enlightenment. So when they were crafting their new Constitution, they looked to learn from history, their own experiences, the best political theory of their day. And between the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, the American people were governed at the national level by the Articles of Confederation and at the state level by state constitutions. They learned from both of these experiences. And when they created their new Constitution, they were looking to create a new national government that was more powerful than the national government established by the Articles of Confederation, but also one of limited power. So there's a way in which they're looking to learn from old experiences, lived experiences of their own, but also try to adapt them to this new situation, creating this new Constitution. The big question for us, really, I think, is what did the founding generation learn from those intervening years, from the Declaration to the US Constitution? It's only a little over a decade. It's only a little over a decade. So the question is, how do we get from the Declaration of Independence in 1776 to the Constitutional Convention in 1787?
And I love how you lay that out, that, great invention and great creation doesn't just come like a light bulb going off in the middle of the dark, that they're reading, they're researching, and they're watching the experimentation going on across the colonies and the new states to say, what is the best we can do? And let's cherry pick it from time, from other governments, and from our own examples in the state. So I love that idea that it's not just a blank slate that they're writing, but they're coming with so many tools. And they come to Philadelphia. They come to Philadelphia in 1787, and this kind of really starts to begin to lay us out into what were we living under on the way to the Constitutional Convention? What kind of system of government we were living under? You talked about it a little bit, but can you dive in a little bit deeper to that road to the convention, the Declaration to the Articles?
Absolutely. So we're gonna go, Curry, I think, from the Articles to state constitutions to Shays Rebellion. So we'll do a little bit about each. But the big thing to remember here is, even as we're ticking through all of these lived experiences of the founding generation, and we can, through this, looking backwards, see a lot of the flaws in these systems of government, we have to remember that for the founders, this was an unbelievably exciting moment. It was one of the most exciting moments in the history of the world, if you ask them. It was an opportunity to create a new nation, and through reflection, choice, reason, the input of the American people, figure out the best way to build a government at the national level and at the state levels. So let's begin at the national level. Before we had the US Constitution and the government we have today, we have the Articles of Confederation. So if there's one big thing we want to remember about the Articles of Confederation, it's that it was a weak national government. Remember, we just fought a revolution against a distant and powerful king and government in Great Britain. We didn't want to create a new, powerful, distant government here in America at the national level. And so we created this weak framework of government. You know, in terms of the institutions of this Articles of Confederation, a few notable things. One, it was run by Congress. So it was run by a single house of Congress. So there's no US House, no US Senate. It's a single Congress. There's also no separate executive branch at the national level, no separate judicial branch at the national level. And importantly, the states themselves had equal power. So every state received a single vote, whether they were as big as Virginia or Pennsylvania, the really big states, or as small as Rhode Island or Connecticut. So each state received the same number of votes. The next thing to note, so that's the structure, but the Articles of Confederation also just frankly didn't grant a lot of power to the national government. So the national government didn't have many of the things we would think of today as things that national governments do. It didn't have the power to tax. It didn't have the states to raise troops for the national army. And it actually couldn't even get states to send money to the national government. So there were just ways in which the national government itself was quite limited. And importantly, too, though, there was a mechanism for making the Articles of Confederation better. There was an amendment process, but it required the approval of every state. The amendment process required unanimity. And Curry, we know how easy it is to choose meals with our families. Trying to do that in and of itself by unanimous vote, pretty much impossible. You could imagine how well that worked under the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, I was going to say, come on, we can't even choose pizza toppings in my house with unanimous vote. So 100% everybody has to agree to tax people. That's just not going to happen. A couple of things real quick that I wanted to clarify for our students. We talked in the beginning that the founding generation were thinkers of the Enlightenment period. And I just wanted to make sure our students, and sorry, I should have asked this earlier, what does that mean for our students? So the founders were children of the Enlightenment. What does that mean that they were children of for everybody, just so we understand that statement?
Yeah, I mean, it's growing out of the idea that the founders believed in the power of reason, sort of the power of learning from experience. And really, because of that, we're drawing from a lot of the great political thinkers of what we would call the Enlightenment period, people like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But more than anything, it's a sensibility. It's this idea that the world is out there. We have access to our own powers of reason, and we can reason together to make the world a better place.
And that kind of helps the students understand why they started with this very open group. So it's one big group of people as the leadership for each state. They all get equal vote. They have to do things unanimously. It's very like crowdsourced in the beginning, but it doesn't work. And so they talked about taxes and commerce between the states. And just to make sure all of our students know, what is commerce between the states, just so we're clear in our definition.
Yeah, so this is just businesses going back and forth across state lines. It's what we take for granted today, that we're just one big economy. But at this particular point in time, and that the national government will play a role in making sure that economy works. But at this point in time, the national government's given very little power over that.
Got it. So it's almost like each state's its own country, and they're trading and bartering and exchanging money across state lines. And we really don't see that today. So it's a very different world that they're living under before the Constitution. So do you want to talk a little bit about the governments that they're living under and how each state is like its own country?
Absolutely. I mean, one way to think about this is the Articles of Confederation, the government it's creating, is a lot more like today's United Nations than the United States of America. These are, in many ways, 13 independent countries kind of brought together under this umbrella. And so with the Articles of Confederation, we have, some serious problems where the national government can't tax. So Congress can't fund the national government, pay its soldiers. The national government struggles to defend the American frontier. And because these different states are more like different countries, they put up barriers of trade between one another. And as a result, the American economy struggles. So that's sort of the framework at the national level. And in many ways, because the national government is so weak, we are really, America as a whole is governed by 13 separate governments. So in 1776, the American colonies set up state constitutions. And this, again, this was where, for a lot of the founding generation, this is where the action was. They felt most connected to their states, and what they're being called on to do in creating these state constitutions is think about what their ideal government will look like based on their own experience in the world and what they've read about history, and then to write it into a constitution. So this, in a way, is a constitutional revolution itself. It's our commitment to a written constitution. And so, as we're looking at this, they're drawing on certain principles that they all share as they're putting together these different constitutions. There are different forms of government in different states, but they're drawing on one big idea of what they would call the theory of a mixed constitution. So here they're learning from the British Constitution that they lived under as colonists, and one that they still thought, for the most part, worked very well. And the idea here is that there are three key sources of political power in society. And so if you think about it in the context of Great Britain, there's the one, which would be the monarchy, the few, which would be the aristocracy, or in Great Britain, the House of Lords, and then the many, which would be the democracy, or in their case, the House of Representatives. And as we translated this into state constitutions, we would see the one embodied in the states in what we would call usually a governor, and we still do. So there's sort of the governor is the embodiment of the one. The few is the upper house of the state legislature, often called the Senate. And then the many is the lower house of the state legislature, often referred to as an assembly. And so the idea is that the assembly, that lower house of the legislature, is going to be the one that's most democratic. It's closest to the people. It has the greatest representatives. And as such, what you'll see in state constitution after state constitution during this period is that the state constitution makers place most of the power in the lower house of the state legislatures. And the concern here is that, in the end, you're giving too much power to a single branch of government. And as a result, any branch of government receiving too much power is prone to abuse. It's prone to making bad decisions. It's prone to sometimes doing things that are good for a bunch of people and really bad for a small number of people. And so what the founders learned from this period of time is that this move to give a lot of power to one single branch, one part of the state legislature, basically created bad policy. It created bad policy that in many ways wound up harming the American economy. And so as they're thinking about how to reconstruct constitutions moving forward, they think we need to rebalance the power between the one, the few, and the many. And so what we need to do is we need to give the governor of states more power. We need to maybe figure out a way in which we can give the upper house of the legislature some power to check the lower house. And furthermore, we think that there's going to be great value in there being an independent judiciary to help enforce the limits that we place in the Constitution and many of the broad protections of rights. And so for the founding generation during this period, many of them looked to the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which is created a little bit further along. It's a few years after the Declaration of Independence, a few years after the first wave of state constitutions. And Massachusetts is already learning from the experience under the other state constitutions. Notably, the Massachusetts Constitution is written largely by John Adams. And so John Adams writes this very famous pamphlet during this period called it The Thoughts on Government, where he's asking the big question, how do we create a constitution that can find the right balance between the one, the few, and the many? And so what they try to do with the Massachusetts Constitution is to still give a lot of power to the lower house of the legislature, the assembly, the most democratic branch, the many, but also place more checks in place. And so in the Massachusetts Constitution, we see really an important commitment to both the separation of powers and checks and balances. With this, the Massachusetts Constitution creates a more powerful and independent governor that's elected directly by the people and that's given a veto over state legislation, which means that the state legislature can pass new laws, but the governor can say no and reject those laws. So it's an important check put in place if the legislature is making bad policy. But they also create a powerful and independent judiciary that sets up another check in there. And so as the founders are putting together the US Constitution in 1787, they're looking back at the Massachusetts Constitution as a model for creating separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers being the dividing the powers of government between three branches of government, and checks and balances being the idea that we're going to provide each branch of government with the power to check the others.
And a little bit of overlap. And don't worry, students, we're going to dive into these separately with a little bit more, but what a great example And again, you can see why they look to the states to say, what are you doing? How are you learning? What's working and what's not, so we can take those ideas. So they almost went, it's like they went to a government smorgasbord before writing the Constitution and picked all their favorite things from this awesome smorgasbord and put it on their plate. There's always a food reference when I'm involved. So you're watching this happen in the states, and it sounds almost dreamy. You know, all these little state democracies being tested and explored. It's like the best chemistry lab you can imagine. But it's actually not so dreamy. Things aren't going so well. So it's a great case study, but the reality is that most of the states are falling apart. And that's what leads us to the story of Shays Rebellion. And it's just one example of how badly we're falling apart as a League of Friendship. So Tom, tell us the story about Daniel Shay, the rebellion, and how this kind of energizes that move to write a new national government.
Yeah, and thing to remember here is that what the states are doing in creating these new constitutions is new and hard. And you would expect over time to get better at it. You would expect to make mistakes and hopefully improve. But what we're talking about here with Shays Rebellion, it's a decade after the Declaration of Independence, so it's 1786. We see the national government's burdened by a huge Revolutionary War debt. We see businesses failing. We see trade suffering. We see state governments that we don't think are responding very well in many ways to the problems. And we see a national government that basically has very little power to shape policies in ways to address the concerns of the American people. And then we have Shays Rebellion, which is just an important symbol of the chaos of these times. So what happens there? Well, it's late 1786, and farmers in Western Massachusetts are suffering from high land taxes, growing debt, a feeling that the economy and then the political elites in their state aren't really serving them. And so they decide to take matters into their own hands. And they're led by Daniel Shays. So who's he? He's a 39-year-old veteran of the American Revolution. He fought at Lexington, he fought at Bunker Hill, and he leads a bunch of farmers in Western Massachusetts to basically try to march across the state. And what they want to do is they want to end up in Boston at the seat of government because they feel like the state government's not hearing their concerns, and they want to make sure that they do. But as they're marching across Massachusetts, what are they doing? They're seizing control of court buildings, making sure that courts can't take possession of people's farms. They're forcing debtors' prisons to close, and they even attempted to get the arsenal, the state arsenal of Springfield, Massachusetts. And one of the problems here is that under the Articles of Confederation, Congress knows this is happening. Congress, the national government, knows it's happening, but it doesn't actually have the power to raise an army or a militia to challenge these farmers in Massachusetts. So who ends up putting down the rebellion? It's a Massachusetts militia. And so for the founding generation, people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, especially George Washington, they're looking at Shays Rebellion in horror. Remember, this is Massachusetts. This is one of the states with a really good constitution, a good structure of government. And their concern is that this is a turn possibly towards mob rule. And, you know, maybe it's not going to be a one-off. Maybe it's the first among many. And what we have is a situation where many people have legitimate concerns about how their states are addressing the many issues that they care about, how the national government is. And the national government doesn't really have the power to address those concerns. And so we see a growth, we see a movement towards wanting to create a new structure of government at the national level. And so we see James Madison and Alexander Hamilton trying to get a national convention together. And then we see them finally getting Congress to call a convention in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And so this is what will become the Constitutional Convention, which will meet in May 1787. And importantly, Madison and Hamilton make sure that in many ways, the most important American is there sitting in the room. You could see him in the picture right there at the front standing, and that's George Washington.
Awesome, Tom. And I think Shays Rebellion is so important that it's not just a bunch of people that didn't want to pay their taxes. You know, it really is just showing all the flaws and all the issues. And I love that you bring up the fact that it's Massachusetts people. This was the best case scenario going on in this state, and they're still having this system fall apart. So energizes people to come to Philadelphia. They all start to come to Philadelphia in early May. By May 25th, they get a quorum. And today, in today's class, we have a Constitution 101 class, and I can send everybody that as well at the end of the week wrap up. So we'll go through in all the details what happens at the convention. But today, we're going to dive deep into the big principles that the Constitution is structured around. We hinted to them earlier: checks and balances, separation of power. We've talked about them in weeks prior to the revolution. We talk about these over and over again because these are major principles that took years to build in and are still being explored today. How are we balancing these pieces? And so much of this is a balancing game and a balancing act and seeing if we're in the right level. So as we dive into those big principles and the key principles underlying the United States Constitution, we're going to tick through them one by one, from popular sovereignty to republicanism, and get clear definitions and see examples of how they work. So Tom, we've got 9 minutes. We can do it.
It's perfect. Yes, I think it'll give us just enough to whet everyone's appetite. So let's start with the idea of popular sovereignty. What do we mean by that? Well, it's just a fancy way of saying that the US Constitution establishes a government that's driven by us. Not a monarch, not the elites, not an aristocracy, but by us, the American people. So where do we see this idea in the Constitution? Just think about the opening words themselves of the preamble: we the people. So generally speaking, when we refer to popular sovereignty, we're talking about rule by the people, the idea that the ultimate authority, the ultimate legitimacy in the Constitution is derived from the people themselves. This is the idea that, sure, we have a president, we have a Congress, we have the courts, but they're not the boss. We are, and we get to call the shots in the end. They work for us. So at its core, popular sovereignty, it's the idea that people are the source of the government's authority, and from that comes a really important responsibility and duty, and that's to make the government better over time. And so this is like, in a fancy way the founders say it, it's the right to alter or abolish the government, but it's the idea that whether it's tyranny or whether it's just some flaws in the system, that we can make changes big and small, whether it's something big like a revolution or creating a new constitution, or something smaller like passing new laws or amending the Constitution. That in the end, all of those ways are ways in which the American people, the people themselves, can shape the government in important ways.
And I love that you use the word duty, and now I sound like that movie that I'm totally blanking on the name right now, but the idea that it's our job. Part of popular sovereignty is that there's an energetic republic, that people are a part of that and saying when they want to change the Constitution, add new laws. And yeah, we can even go to abolish the government, but maybe we just start small and add some laws and maybe the 28th Amendment or things like that. So do you want to kind of, I know we're ticking through these really quickly. Do you want to dive into social contract for a second or jump to the next big idea?
Well, yeah, I can say one quick thing about social contract theory, then next big idea, but popular sovereignty is right in the middle. Like, one of the roots of it is social contract theory. And so this is the idea that all power comes from the people and that government itself ends up being a contract between the people and their government. So we give away some of our power to the government, and then the government then, because of that, takes on certain duties and responsibilities to us. As we explained in the Declaration of Independence, in many ways, it comes down to safety and happiness, and making sure that the government is securing, above all of our rights, our God-given rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and that we are all born free and equal.
Awesome. Okay, so dive into, what is federalism?
Yeah, so federalism is the next big idea here. And so this is just a word that's used to describe the fact that we divvy some of the powers of the national government, some of the powers of the government to the national government, and some of the powers to the states. So it's that division of power between the national government and the states. And as a result, really, the conflicts and debates we see between the states and the national government over time. So where do we see this idea in the Constitution itself? Well, there's no federalism clause of the Constitution. Really, the word doesn't appear in there. But once you begin to look at the Constitution, you can see that federalism's everywhere. And so Curry listed all of these provisions on the screen. Take a look at them while I'm talking, and you can just see it's everything from Article 1, so near the beginning of the original Constitution, all the way into amendments like the 10th Amendment and the Reconstruction Amendments. Federalism is everywhere. And the reason why is that for the founding generation, it was such an important principle. It was an important principle in a big and diverse nation, one where people felt very connected to their states, to their localities, to their towns, where they didn't travel as much. That part of what we wanted to do in creating the new Constitution was to ensure that we kept a lot of power in the government levels closest to the people. And this would allow, in a nation as diverse as ours, diverse even at the founding, but all the way through up until today, for different states, different localities to pursue different policies that really suited the needs and desires of their own people. And so the big image here, it famously comes from Justice Louis Brandeis in 1932, who referred to the states as laboratories of democracy. It was just such a wonderful statement, a wonderful way to think about part of what states are doing is they're shaping policies in education, in health, in the environment, et cetera, that they serve as laboratories of democracy. And so the idea here is that you might have different states pursue different policies on, say, taxes or wages or education or what have you. And that over time, by doing that, one of the things that could happen is that we as a nation can learn from that experience, that we could develop better policies that are really responsive to our concerns and can really help people across the country. So one thing that you see, the hope is that through federalism, sometimes good ideas bubble up. And so where do we see this in history? The greatest example may be the idea of women's suffrage, the women's right to vote. That started out west. It started in the states. And it was state by state, women's suffrage expanding further and further east over time, including to big states like Michigan, New York, all allowing women's suffrage even before we ratified the 19th Amendment. So it was a way for women's suffrage, women's voting to be an experiment that happened on a state-by-state basis. We saw that it worked well, and then we made it the rule for the nation. The flip side, Curry, is that by creating a national government, we can also give the national government power to tell the states, no, you can't do that. No, in America, that is not the way we do it. Classic example there is civil rights legislation. So we see in the states after the Civil War, after Reconstruction in the late 1800s, Jim Crow beginning to emerge, discrimination against African Americans, and it's ultimately the national government, both the Supreme Court in cases like Brown versus Board of Education, but Congress and the president and the civil rights movement working together to pass landmark statutes like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So there's the national government checking the states.
And again, it's those checks and balances. So much of this is about how did they set up a system of federalism to spread out the power from the national government to the state governments to the local government. But that spreading out of power is also what happens at the national level. So I always think about this as like a layered cake, and then a layered cake in this direction as well, both vertical and horizontal. That is what we would say is separation of powers. So that's still about spreading out jobs and spreading out powers. How is the national government broken up as well?
Yeah, no, that's a great way to thinking of it, Curry, because part of the founders are concerned about where political power is going to go. So yes, one is federalism, dividing it between the national government and the states. And the other is that once we create a new national government, it's separating it between three branches of government. This is the idea of the separation of powers. So just to give quick definitions, the separation of powers is us taking political power and dividing it into three branches of government at the national level: a legislative branch, Congress, which makes the laws; the executive branch, led by a president, which enforces the laws; and the judicial branch, headed by a Supreme Court that interprets the laws. And then at the same time, what they do is they also set up what we call a system of checks and balances. So here the idea is that the Constitution is granting each branch of government the power to check the other branches. So just to see this in action, the easiest way is think about the lawmaking process. So Congress, again, under the separation of powers, is given the power to make the laws. They pass the laws. But then also, once a law passes Congress, the president is given the veto power. So the president gets the bill, it ends up on the president's desk, and the president can veto it. It can say, no, I'm not going to sign this particular bill, sends it back to Congress. So that's one check in place. The other is that even if Congress passes a law, even if the president signs a law, an individual citizen, just one single American who claims that their rights are violated, can go to court, challenge that law, say that it's unconstitutional, and federal judges, using the power of judicial review, can decide whether that particular law passed by Congress, signed by the president, is constitutional or unconstitutional. So there's that final check. It's the Congress having the power to pass the law, the president whether or not to veto a law, and the courts deciding using judicial review whether a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. Finally, if we the people disagree, what can we do? We can use the Article 5 amendment process in the Constitution to change the Constitution itself, because the founding generation didn't believe it had a monopoly on constitutional wisdom. It also didn't believe that the government branches should be our bosses. In the end, the ultimate say is ours.
Perfect. And we have a lot of questions. So real quickly, because I feel like nobody ever talks about this, when you're talking about the idea and the principle of republicanism, can you kind of explain that to our students? Because people tend to throw that around on the news and the media, but we need a clean definition and understanding of what it means.
Absolutely. So, I mean, at some basic level, Republican government simply means government by the people to a certain extent. So it's an idea of representative government. We're not going to have a king or an elite. In the end, we're going to elect representatives who represent us. So there's an aspect of it, and in many ways, the most important part of it is that structural point, that it's providing the people elect representatives who represent us. But in a deeper sense, it's also, for at least for the founders, it was there's a moral dimension to the American Revolution and also to republicanism itself. And it really goes to the character of the sort of constitution they were trying to create and the sort of people that they wanted to be. And they looked to the example of classical antiquity. They looked to ancient Greece. They looked to ancient Rome. And they wanted the new government and American society as a whole to commit to what they called civic republican virtue. So that's a mouthful. But really what that means is that they wanted the people and their representatives to choose virtue over vice, so good rather than bad, reason over passion, and also commit to the public good rather than the private self-interest. So Curry, it's this combination of a structure of government that's giving the people themselves a say in how government's going to work. So there's a connection between popular sovereignty in that sense and this vision of republicanism. It's making sure that structure's in place to ensure that the people themselves have an input over time in how the government's going to create policy. But in a deeper sense, it's a vision of what that government and the larger society is going to look like. And that's a society and a government committed to virtue, not vice, reason, not passion, the public good, not private self-interest. And the last thing I'll note, Curry, is because they were students of history, they knew and they believed deeply that republics were fragile, because they look to the example, especially of ancient Rome, and they look to what they just know from history, looking at country after country. And what they learn, and even look at themselves, frankly, is that people are flawed, republics are fragile, and that republics often collapse. And so they really urge both the leaders in society, but the American people as a whole to remain on guard, and really on guard against abuses and corruption in government, but also on guard within themselves to try to master their own passions, their own self-interest, and to try to serve the common good.
So, and I think that's so important. So they're saying a republic, the people have voice and agency in their government. At the same time, you need to do the right thing as leaders in that government, but they're not crazy enough to put in other systems to make sure this works. And that's why we have all these principles working together to create the structure of government and to balance all the humans as well as the leadership, as well as the needs of the people from the state level to the national level. All those pieces are really, really important. So thank you, Tom, for walking us through all these pieces. I'm going to go over a couple questions real quick. One of our students really quickly just wanted us to circle back on the Massachusetts state constitution. So can you just walk us through the three big ideas around that? So what did the judicial branch look like? Who was the support of the House, and kind of how the Massachusetts state constitution was laid out? And then two more questions for you. But students, if you have to jump at this time, we absolutely understand, but we're just going to circle back on a few ideas because we know there's a lot in this one.
Absolutely. So the most important thing about the Massachusetts Constitution, remember, is it created a powerful and independent governor. And so this was different than other state constitutions at the time. The two big things there with the governor was that the governor was elected by the voters. So the governor was not selected by the state legislature, as was the case in nearly every other state constitution. And that the governor was given a veto power, an independent veto power that the governor could exercise themselves over legislation. Again, this was different than the other state constitutions. So it's creating this powerful and independent governor. In many ways, that was seen as the biggest check on basically legislation driven by passion that you would find in the other state constitutions in the era. So that's part of it. Another is if you look at the state legislature, and John Adams cared a lot about this, what it tried to do is create a distinct upper house. So the Senate itself, they tried to create sort of property requirements and things like that, which would ensure that the upper house, the Massachusetts State Senate, would represent the sort of the wealthier and the more elite within Massachusetts society. So within the state legislature, you would have a lower house, the state assembly, which would have more representatives, fewer property qualifications, and would more closely both look like, but also represent the views of the people. So it would be very close to the immediate preferences of the people, whereas you would have an upper house, which theoretically would represent more the propertied, the wealthy, the elite. And so the hope would be between representing the interests of the many and the few in a closer sense, that you would end up with better policy. And then finally, the judiciary, it was independent of various controls from either a governor or a state legislature. And as a result, it looked a lot more like what we would find in the US Constitution itself, where there are some protections for salary to make sure that they can't easily be removed from office by the state legislature and the governor. And so the idea being that you would have not just a governor that can veto legislation passed by the legislature, but you would actually have an independent judiciary with some power to also exercise checks in two ways. One, maybe it's representing some of the rights that you would find in the Massachusetts Constitution, but importantly would also police some of the limits that you might find on the power of the state legislature and the governor.
Awesome. And then just one more follow-up question that I absolutely loved. So federalism, that idea of, my parfait, of spreading out the power in layers. Uriel asked, is that costly? And I never thought of it like that before. All these separation, these multiple branches, the Neapolitan of the national government, the parfait of federalism. I'm getting all my food analogies in here. That does put a lot of people into the system, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, is federalism a more costly system?
It can be. I mean, if you're looking at, when you're constructing a constitution, you can either construct it in a way that makes it very easy to get things done at a national level that affects everyone. And therefore, politics can move fairly quickly. And you can have a single policy that's uniform across the country. And if you have the right policy, by all means, that sort of efficiency and that sort of uniformity is of great value. For the founding generation, they did want governments that worked both at the state and the national level, but they were also, I think, they had a lot of intellectual humility in the sense that they were concerned a lot about too much power consolidating in a national government when you have a very diverse nation very tied closely to their individual states. And so federalism makes it more difficult to advance, say, something like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It has to jump through about a bazillion hoops in the national government to get it in place and shape policy in ways that today we would say are really attractive to advance, the cause of equality, et cetera, and have that be the law of the nation writ large. But the founding generation thought that, sometimes you're going to set national policy and set it the wrong way, or in a way that's not going to really work for a lot of different people, where the right or wrong isn't nearly as clear. And as a result, they'd rather err on the side of diversity, both for the sake of not having the wrong policy set for the entire nation, but also that Brandeisian, what Louis Brandeis said, laboratories of democracy, the idea that maybe we don't have the right answer yet. And if we just watch what the states do, we can come up with a better policy. And it allows us to be bold in certain states and to learn from that boldness. Because many people, for instance, when women got the right to vote out west, people said this is going to be a disaster. It's going to be bad for women and it's going to be bad for these states. And we would look at that experience and say, that's crazy. And we learned from it. And as a result, we have the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage throughout the nation. So, but yeah, you're right. All of these checks, this division of power between the national government and the states with federalism, and then separation of powers at both the national and state level, dividing power between the branches of government, creates a less efficient system. Sometimes we're not able to act as quickly as many people would like, but it's seen as a way of checking abuses.
Yeah, and if that slowing down of the system is a part of the checks and balances, that it takes us longer to make big change across the nation. I love this laboratories of democracy, and yes, we have seen it do good things and do not so good things, but the idea is so reflective back on looking at the state constitutions and pulling great ideas from the state constitutions. So I love when you can see those patterns in history and those complementary understandings of this is what we've learned from, let's figure out how do we use this system again. Tom, thank you so much for going through each one in such great detail and helping us circle back and make sure we had clarity on the different pieces. This was such a fun class, such an interesting class, and I hope all the students enjoyed it as well. If you have any questions, always feel free to email us, and we will see you all next week in class. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks everyone.